welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new here and welcome back if you are not. Today I want to talk about all of the weirdest books that I've ever read. Because this is a channel that celebrates reading diversely and reading from many different genres, we're not just going to be sticking with contemporary or horror kind of weird fiction, which is what I find you usually get in recommendation videos like this. I'm going to be going through a few different genres here. We are going to be covering some in that kind of specific genre of that horror, weird, creepy, unsettling fiction. But I'm also going to be just talking about the weirdest books that I've ever read in all genres. So we have some sci-fi, we have some classics, we have some non-fiction here. So I'm very excited to jump in. There's about 10 or 11 books on this list today, so I'm just going to get started and jump right in with the first book. And we are first starting off with that kind of I'm calling it contemporary weird fiction, but there's one book that I just needed to start with. Like, no matter what else was in this video, this book had to be one of the first books that I mentioned, because to me this one is the #1 weirdest book I've ever read. It's not just weird, it's deeply unsettling, and that book is The Discomfort of Evening. If you've ever heard me talk about this book before, you know it makes me feel just so uncomfortable to even look at this cover, because this book is so strange, so weird, very disgusting, and very unsettling. But let me tell you a little bit about what it's about. So basically, in this book, you are following a family in a very isolated and rural community in the Netherlands, and they own a farm. You are following Jazz, who is a 10-year-old girl, and at the very beginning of this book, she is worried that her dad's going to kill her pet rabbit. So she makes a promise to God, and she says, please don't let my dad kill my rabbit, take my brother instead. And then when her brother gets into a fatal accident, it's kind of the repercussions of what happens to her and her family as they go through this grieving process. This book really explores that weird childhood, girlhood, kind of growing up in this really isolated community when you are trying to figure out the answers to so many questions in this world, but also your whole family is in the throes of grief. And I did feel just so sorry for Jazz. This book is excellently written, but it means that it's even more uncomfortable to actually read. Basically, Jazz starts exhibiting some very strange behaviours, but also the rest of her family are also very strange. She basically decides to never take off her coat again, as you can see in the cover of the book. But this is just like the kind of tip of the iceberg of the weird stuff that Jazz and her family get up to. And definitely check trigger warnings if you are going into this, and content warnings, just so you know what to kind of expect, because there is a lot of disturbing content in this book. But essentially, I didn't like this book because I hated reading it, but it does mean that it was very well written. And also I think that a lot of the concept of this book is talking about how discomfort is one of the only honest and true feelings that we have. And so it kind of explores that concept, but also by making you, the reader, feel extreme levels of discomfort while you're reading it. So it's a very, very interesting book, and it's very well done. I personally hated it, but I could also definitely recommend it to people who like this type of fiction, because it's a very, very excellently done book. So the next book is kind of still in this category of slightly unsettling and strange fiction, contemporary fiction, and it's also another translated book. That one is also translated from Dutch, and this book is actually translated from Korean. So the next book I want to talk about is The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and this book I actually really loved. It basically follows one woman and her decision to decide to stop eating meat, and the implications that that has for her and the people around her, but you never actually follow from inside the woman's mind herself. You're following various people in her life, following her husband and her sister and other people, and you deep dive into the repercussions that this simple kind of decision has, how different people treat her, and also kind of how this one small decision really snowballs in terms of her own life. This book explores sibling relationships and also female sexuality and like dark and hidden desires. And yeah, this is just basically an excellent book, and I really, really recommend it. Next up, we have a short story collection, and it's one of my favourite books. I think this is one of the only short story collections that I've rated 5 out of 5 stars, and I absolutely loved it. And that is Cursed Bunny. As with short story collections, usually there is, you know, some stories that hit harder than others, and there are some that are weirder than others in this book, but in general this whole collection is just something that will really get you thinking, something that is constantly going to be surprising you and making you feel like disgust and confusion, and it's very shocking but in quite a delightful way. Weirdly, the way that it's written is just so good. I think the sun is just going to be unreasonable for the rest of the afternoon, so we're just gonna power through. Sorry about the weird lighting. I know it's gonna probably look weird, and I don't think I can even directly look in front of the camera because my eyes are gonna hurt, but we're just gonna carry on with filming. Basically, I was talking about Cursed Bunny, and this is really hard to decide on what genre this is trying to be, because I think I would primarily say it's a horror book, but it also definitely has magical realism and sci-fi elements to it. So it's one of those books that you'll start a story and you just never know where the story is going to go. Especially ones that stick out to me are a story about a woman with a head in their toilet and what that means for her life. I think primarily just the strength of this book comes from its ability just to shock you. You don't know what you're going to get with each and every story. So this one is a 5 out of 5 stars for me. If you like weird fiction, especially horror leaning weird fiction, then definitely pick up Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung. And the final in this kind of contemporary weird fiction section is not a horror book, but it is definitely a weird book, and a book that I don't get to talk about nearly enough for how much that I loved it, and it is Pod by Lelaine Paul. So I loved this book so much when I read it last year. This is a book from the perspective of a dolphin, and not just a dolphin, but a few different sea creatures, and it's nowhere near what you would expect, having known that that's how it's narrated, because this book is so heartbreaking and hopeful and tragic, and I literally cried while reading it, and I found it so exhilarating to read, and it's just so unique and such a strange book that is just also, I think, beautifully done. Basically, Pod, you follow a few different characters, but one of them is Ia, who is a dolphin who's never quite fit in with her other dolphins in her pod. And basically something happens where she has to leave the safety of her family and has to kind of go on a journey and try and survive on her own. If you're interested in climate fiction, cli-fi, then you should definitely pick this up, because it's such a beautiful take on what we are doing to our oceans and how humans are interacting with all other non-human beings. I loved the exploration of community and survival in this book, and it's so good. It's so good. Don't be put off by the fact that it's from the perspective of a dolphin. I absolutely love this book. And also I really enjoyed Lelaine Paul's other book, which is called The Bees, which is from the perspective of a bee. So if you're interested in either of those books, definitely read them. She's a fantastic writer. So the next section I want to talk about is classics, and this might be kind of, some of the books here are going to be more familiar to you, especially if you like weird and strange fiction, especially this first book that I want to talk about, which is Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. So I think most people will be familiar with the concept of this story, but in case you're not, basically Metamorphosis begins when a man wakes up in the morning and he's trying to go to work, but he realizes that he has turned into a ginormous insect, cockroach-like being, and basically you just follow what this means for him as he wants to go about his day and the reactions that his family have, and it's such a strange little book, and I think it's one of the origins of this weird surrealist type of fiction. So if you're interested in weird fiction, it's a great place to read, especially as a classic. It's not very long, and it's one of those books that has so many different interpretations about the meaning, and I think that there's so many different ways that you could take this as a story, where it be an anti-capitalist message or the way that we treat people who have got illnesses or diseases. I just think this one is an essential read for anyone interested in weird books. So the next classic that I want to talk about is A Clockwork Orange, which is a very difficult book to read because of how it's written. But basically, if you don't know what this is about, this is a dystopian set in the future. This was written, I think, in the 60s, but set in the far future in a dystopian world. And basically, in this near future, there is a huge culture of violence and depravity, and you follow main character and also his friends. They're young teenagers, I think, but you're kind of following them as they're rebelling against the government and society and having their own kind of youth subculture of extreme violence. So I would also say check warnings before going into this book. But this book is so difficult to read because of this slang and the language that's used. So the author was imagining how our language would have evolved in the future, and it's very, very difficult to read at the very beginning of the book because so much of the book is written in this type of slang, and you just have to let go of how you want to interpret the book and just read it in a way of knowing that you're not going to pick up on every single little meaning of all of the words. And as you go through, you start learning the slang as well. Like the character's almost teaching it to you as you're kind of reading the book. So it's a very strange, very weird little book. And also, I do think very worth it. I've not watched the movie because I'm actually so squeamish in terms of watching movies, but I can read quite disturbing books, as you can see from some of the books on this list already. But I would say it's definitely worth a read, especially if you like the movie and if you like classic dystopian kind of books. So the next book I want to talk about is something that I had on my TBR for so many years. I think I had it on there for like almost 10 years probably, and I just never read it because it was a classic and I just had never picked it up. I thought it was going to be something, I thought it was going to be kind of like a classic about war, and even though I like to try and read most classics, I just for some reason was really not interested in reading it. And then at the end of last year I picked up this book and I was just so shocked at what I found because it's one of the weirdest books I've ever read and it was so much fun. And that book is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, and I should have known really because I do know that Kurt Vonnegut has a kind of reputation for this very strange types of fiction, but I just had no idea that Slaughterhouse-Five would be written how it is written, because it is a war book. You're following veterans of a war and the timeline is kind of very disjointed. It's flashing back to during the war, being held, like these characters being held as prisoners of war, but also you're flashing forward in time. And I almost don't want to tell you too much about this book, but I would just say give it a go. It's really interesting. It's so unique in how it's written, and I absolutely loved this book and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. But I don't want to tell you any more about the plot or even really kind of the themes and what it's exploring, other than it's a anti-war novel. I think it's quite similar, I would say, in terms of themes to Catch-22 if you've ever read that, but I preferred Slaughterhouse-Five so much because of how it's written, and I'm definitely going to pick up more of Kurt Vonnegut's books from now on because I just loved it. The last book in this classics section is another translated book, and it's one of the, as I said before, one of the strangest books I've ever read. So the last book in this classics section is also a translated book, and it's one of the most weird and also most confusing books I've ever read, and that is The Blind Owl. So this is an Iranian book and it's translated. Honestly, it was so confusing to read, and this is one of those books where I do think I needed to almost study this like with an academic of Iranian literature so I could get all of the context that was involved in this book. But even if I think I knew all of the context, I think it would still be one of the strangest books I've ever read because of the way that it's written. It's really hard to blurb this book because even this edition doesn't even include a blurb at all, and a lot of actually this copy is made up of the difficulties of translating this book because of how it's written. So this book is so confusing because it's very much, you're not sure what it's even about. You have this main character and he is detailing the loss of this mysterious lover that he has had. But even that is not quite true or what this book is about, because this book will constantly shift timelines and between what seems to be fiction and reality, and the main character is either dead or high on opium or making stuff up or completely sane, and you never actually know which is true and what's going on in the book because of how it's written in such a confusing and really twisty, symbolism heavy kind of way. And it's also quite a unsettling and scary book even in itself, because this main character is losing his mind, or they've already lost their mind, or they're completely sane, and you never actually know. It's such a strange little book. I think I read somewhere that the experience of reading this book is supposed to feel like you are going mad, or like you are going into some kind of drug-induced frenzy yourself, and I definitely understand where that's coming from, because I felt so utterly confused for the entirety of this book, and I don't know. So I'm hesitant to even recommend it because I find it very difficult to explain what it's about, and also difficult to explain my experience reading it. But that is The Blind Owl. So a lot of these books that we've been talking about are quite heavy, quite dark, quite terrifying, and I feel like we also need to represent something that is weird but in a fun way. So the next book that I want to talk about is sci-fi book, and it's also one of the funniest books I've ever read, and that is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This book is so much fun. I literally adored reading it. My copy is completely beaten up, and I actually don't think this is even my original copy. So if this is yours, then I'm sorry, because I have kept this for absolutely years, probably upwards of 10 years right now. I don't think I ever actually bought it originally. This book is so much fun, and even from the beginning, like from the front cover, you can see it's very confusing because it says a trilogy in 4 parts, and famously trilogies are in 3 parts, but that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this book. Basically, in this book you are following Arthur Dent, who has just had his house demolished, and he's very upset by this. Then he learns that the entire of the Earth and the human race are also about to be demolished because someone in the galaxy wants to put in a new super space highway where the Earth currently is, so they've decided they're demolishing the Earth. So this is quite a lot to take on for someone who has never even encountered aliens or space before, and basically that's just where this book begins. But you're following Arthur Dent, and I just love the tone of these books the most. It's like in that bizarre, dry, kind of surrealist humour that I just absolutely adored. You never know where these books are going to go. I love the characters, especially Arthur Dent himself, and I think I actually really want to reread this book because I haven't read it in quite a few years. But they are also so full of action. There's so much plot going on, but there's also so much philosophy and commentary about the strangeness of the universe and coincidences and humanity, and it's just, they are such good books, and they deserve all the praise they get, in my opinion. So that is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This book actually contains the whole trilogy, so this is the 4 different books: Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Life, the Universe and Everything, and then the final book is So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. So yes, this is an excellent book and also an excellent trilogy. I think probably the first one was my favourite from recollection, but I do want to reread this whole trilogy / 4-book series. So the final 2 books that I want to talk about in this video are both non-fiction books, because non-fiction books can be very weird too, either with the way that they make you feel or with the books themselves. So the book that I want to talk about first for non-fiction is When We Cease to Understand the World, which I think you can guess from the title is going to be a bit of a strange book in itself. But this book is one of the strangest non-fictions I've ever read, because it starts off as a non-fiction book. Basically, you are following the stories and the discoveries of great inventors, or like great minds of the 21st century, of people who have invented or discovered something to do with a universal truth. So lots of them are following mathematicians or scientists, but basically as you follow these different great men, they are all men in this book, as you follow their stories and their discoveries, the book really talks about this fine line between genius and madness, and also what these big discoveries did to the world in terms of if they brought a better, more peaceful place, or if they just hurried us along the path to chaos. But the strangeness of this book is not only that kind of blend between genius and madness, but also the book itself begins as a non-fiction account, and then as you're reading, and especially very much towards the end, this book becomes a fiction book, and it becomes the author's interpretation about the minds and the lives of some of these men. And I don't want to say much more about it because it's very much an experience and it's really interesting to read. But if you're into science non-fiction and if you think that this would be interesting to you, then definitely pick it up because it's a very fun and very, very interesting book. And then the final book that I really want to talk about is a book that I just don't get to talk about nearly enough, but it's one of probably my favourite non-fictions I've ever read, and it is Reality is Not As It Seems, Is Not What It Seems by Carlo Rovelli. This book is, I mean, the byline is The Journey to Quantum Gravity, but don't let that kind of put you off or pigeonhole this book because it is so, so good. This is one of those books that I read and I felt like I could literally feel my brain being rewired. The way that this talks about reality and the laws of nature and space and time and gravity. I was reading it and I could literally feel the world around me shifting and like my perspective of the world changing. And it is like nothing I've ever experienced before. It is not the easiest read because it is talking about things like space and time and quantum gravity and what reality is made of. But I do think it's perfectly possible to read for everyone and not just people who have an interest in physics or maths or that kind of thing. I did have to read certain passages over and over again just to make sure they were really in my brain. And even now, looking back, I know that I've forgotten huge portions of this book, but I really do want to read it again. But honestly, this book was, I think, written so well as well. These concepts that are huge and have years and years and years and centuries of science and thinking behind them are explained in, I think, the most easy and accessible way to understand for someone who's not studied this. But I absolutely love this book. It's a weird book in itself, but also it will make you feel weird. That's how I'm kind of including it in this list. But also just to say, read this book. It's really, really good. So there we have a great stack of very little weird books. Please let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought and if you agree with me that they are weird. But also I'm really asking for any help in the comments with other recommendations for weird books that I have not included that you also think I might like. I didn't include things like Bunny or Piranesi in this list or This Is How You Lose the Time War. Number one, because I've talked about these books quite a few times on this channel already and I really like them. Also, I think other lists that recommend weird books bring these books up quite a lot. But please let me know if you did enjoy this video and if you like weird books or if you want even more weird book recommendations, because actually I had to cut this down originally. It was even more books than this, but I thought I would stick to 10 or 11 of whatever I've ended up doing. So yeah, thank you so much for watching and please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!